بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على ولعنة الله على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made a promise to the children of Israel, to the children of Yaqub, that eventually they would be the inheritors of the Holy Land. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised them that they would be freed from captivity. For many generations, they suffered under the persecution of Fir'aun. And they were waiting for the advent of that prophet who would save them from oppression. Now, during that period, Bani Israel, they are very similar to us in the sense that they were awaiting that promised prophet of God who would appear and release them from captivity. As Muslims today, we're also waiting and anticipating a divine guide who will not only release one group of people from captivity and suffering and misery and oppression, but rather he will release humanity from that state of mazlumiyya. So on one level, the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to these people, to this nation, is that eventually you will be freed. Through Musa alayhi salam, and this is a discussion that we had last year, through Musa alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he releases them from captivity. And there's a very important lesson here, my dear brothers and sisters. In the same way that it took many, many years for Bani Israel to taste freedom, it's also going to take humanity and the Muslim Ummah quite a long time for Imam al-Mahdi to implement his plan. You see, some of us, we have this impression that when the Mahdi reappears, within 5 business days, it's going to be done. We have this mindset, this expectation that the Imam's movement will be swift and he'll eradicate injustice and establish a global government, and it's all going to be smooth sailing when the Imam arrives. That was the expectation of the Israelites too. Because the Quran tells us that when Musa alayhi salam returns to Egypt and he confronts the Pharaoh and he presents these miracles, there is a waiting period. They continue to suffer. And in fact, there's an ayah in the Quran that tells us that the Israelites, they have Musa amongst them now, and they say to Musa that we were suffering before you and we're still suffering. So what good are you? So there's this expectation that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a promise, that it has to happen right away. So in this way, they were also tested. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through Musa, he takes them across the Red Sea. Now, the ultimate promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not just that they would be rescued. It's not just that you're not going to be mazloom anymore. The ultimate promise is what? For you to be taken out of Egypt. Now that you've went through this phase where you've tasted oppression, you know now what it means to suffer under a tyrant. This was all done to prepare you to be leaders, Because to be an effective leader, you have to be able to empathize with your subjects. The expectation is that you people will never oppress because you knew what it felt like to be oppressed. So the ultimate plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just to take them out of Egypt, it's to deliver them to the Holy Land. And this is what the Quran tells us. To deliver them to the Holy Land and to have Musa alayhi salam rule and implement the law of God. But as we saw last night, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had delivered the promise. They went through all of these trials and tribulations and they had just one thing. There was just one thing left for them to do. And this is where Musa alayhi salam, when they arrive at the borders of the Holy Land, which was the land of Canaan, which was where Yaqub lived with his sons, taking them back to the beginning of the story. And look at the beautiful parallel where Imam al-Mahdi, ajjalallahu ta'ala faraja, what is he going to do? He wants to take us back to the Islam of the Prophet. He wants to take us back to that sacred period. So Musa is taking them back. He's taking them back to the land of Yaqub. He's taking them back to the land of Ibrahim. He's taking them back to their sacred roots. And this is what the Mahdi does. His reappearance revolves around what? Taking the Muslims back to their sacred roots. Taking them back to the Quran. Taking them back to the Ahlul Bayt. So the final command for them to witness the fulfillment of Allah's promise to them, because again, notice that when Allah makes a promise, you also have to do your part. You know, sometimes we expect Allah to just do all the work for us. It reminds me of the story of Maryam in the Quran. She experiences an immaculate conception. The whole story is miraculous. And as she's about, after she delivers Isa alayhi salam, she is told, shake the trunk of the palm tree so that fresh dates fall and that you can eat. Now the question here is, oh Allah, everything about this story is mu'jiza. Why didn't you just make the fresh dates fall? You miraculously made this woman pregnant with a child without the involvement of a father. Isa alayhi salam, just finish the miracle. Let the dates fall. But this is a very important allusion in the Quran. It's a very important lesson that yes, Allah will fulfill His promise, but you have to do something. Even if it's something small, you got to do your part. And what Allah has asked us to do is not something that is significant. Allah just wants a little bit of effort. So in verse 21 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, Musa alayhi salam, you can imagine him after all of those years and those trials and tribulations, you know, back, he's probably thinking about just his entire life, growing up in the palace of Pharaoh. He lived as a fugitive for 10 years, returning to Egypt, facing off against Pharaoh, rescuing Bani Israel, many years in the desert of Sinai. Now they're at the brink of victory. What's left? يَا قَوْمُ ادْخُلُوا الْأَرْضَ الْمُقَدَّسَةَ الَّتِي كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ. O my people, enter the Holy Land. He's not even telling them to fight. He's saying enter. I'm not saying attack anybody, but if people attack you, defend yourself. Enter the Holy Land that Allah has written for you, and do not turn your backs. But what was the answer? Verse 22, قالوا يا موسى إن فيها قوما جبارين. O Musa, there are very powerful people who are in the city. I'll try to pronounce it again. The Amalekites. The Amalekites are there. And the Quran calls them قوما جبارين. These are people that have a lot of military might. وَإِنَّا لَن نَدْخُلَهَا حَتَّى يَخْرُجُوا مِنْهَا. And we will never go in until they go out. فَإِنْ يَخْرُجُوا مِنْهَا فَإِنَّا دَاخِلُونَ. If they leave, then we'll enter. But we don't want to have any conflict with these people. And then, as we mentioned, no one, some of them start to cry. They're afraid. Because, people can talk a big game until it's life and death. That's when you see who has courage and who's all talk. And this is what we see among the companions of Musa, and this is also what we saw in the life of the Prophet. You don't know who's a courageous companion until someone like Amr ibn Wudd al-Amiri comes forward and says, okay, oh Muhammad, send me your men so I can send them to Jannah. And the narrations say, كَأَنَّ عَلَىٰ رُؤُوسِهِمُ الطَّيْرِ. All of a sudden, the loudest of companions become the most silent of them, except someone like Ali ibn Abi Talib. See, this is when courage is tested. And similarly, you find that there emerged among the Israelites two, of course, other than Musa and Harun. The Quran tells us that there were only two men who showed courage. If you look at the Quran, verse 23, among about 700,000 people, people always ask, how is it possible that all of these companions of a prophet disobeyed the prophet? The Quran is telling us. Musa says, enter the city. None of them listened to him. And the next ayah says what? قَالَ رَجُلَانْ مِنَ الَّذِينَ يَخَافُونَ. Two men. The Quran is literally telling us, out of 700,000 of Musa's companions, two of them said what? أُدْخُلُوا عَلَيْهِمُ الْبَابِ. Let's enter. Let us enter, because if you enter, we will be victorious. They believed in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Two, Yusha ibn Nun and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb, they were the only ones among the Israelites. They refused to enter, and the punishment was what? They were now prohibited from entering the Holy Land. Prohibited not as in, they just couldn't even access the city anymore. Subhanallah, when Allah doesn't want you to find something, you're not going to find it. They couldn't find the entrance point. And they continued to wander for many, many years. You were this close to living a life of bliss under a ma'soom who's ruling over you. But because of your disobedience, now you are going to wander. So next time you appreciate the gift that Allah gives. And look, and this is the same story with the Ahlul Bayt. Allah sends someone like Ali, you kill him. Someone like Imam al-Hassan, you poison him. Someone like Imam al-Hussein, the ummah of the Prophet, they don't appreciate divine guidance. So what does Allah do with the last of them? He says, I will reserve this one, but I will let you wander aimlessly, not for 40 years, for over a millennia. So when the divine guide returns, you know that the alternative is very dark. So you should obey, you should listen, you should submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we come to another incident involving Bani Israel. It's very difficult to determine when this incident took place, but presumably it took place during this period after they were prohibited from entering the Holy Land, where they're just wandering aimlessly through the wilderness and through the desert. The Quran mentions a story about a cow, and this story is found in Surah Al-Baqarah. And the surah is actually named after this specific incident. There was a murder that took place. So as you can imagine, you have 700, you have a nation that's just wandering, a stateless people. They're wandering through the deserts, through the wilderness with Musa. And, they have their camps set up. They were semi-stable in the sense that they had an encampment. They weren't entirely nomadic. So you can imagine when you have that many people, life has to go on. People have to get married, have kids. There's naturally going to be conflict. Now, we don't know exactly what the conflict was. There are conflicting narrations about what this conflict was, but a murder took place. There was a dead body that was thrown in front of one of the tents of the Israelites, and you can imagine accusations are flying. This tribe is accusing that tribe, and no one can figure out who the killer is. So, whose problem is this? They come to Musa alayhi salam. Now, Musa alayhi salam, he has to adjudicate. He has to issue a judgment. How are we going to resolve this? Because now there's a lot of tension, and this might escalate and lead to bloodshed among the Israelites themselves. Verse 67 of Surah Al-Baqarah. وَإِذْ قَالَ مُوسَى لِقَوْمِهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ أَن تَذْبَحُوا بَقَرَةً. They come to Musa. Musa, there was a murder that has taken place. This is the body. We don't know who did it. We think it's this person, that person. What should we do? We want you to get involved. Musa says, Allah commands you to slaughter a cow. They're thinking to themselves, what? We're telling you a murder happened. Your response is Allah commands us to slaughter a cow? What does slaughtering a cow have to do with anything? أَتَتَّخِذُنَا هُزُوًا? Are you trying to ridicule us? Now, what's interesting here is, again, we're brought back to this idea of a cow. The command is, Allah wants you to slaughter a cow. Now, it seems that the Israelites, they were traveling with their cattle. They had livestock. Ultimately, that was probably one of the ways that they survived. They were able to gather some livestock. So they're now being commanded to slaughter a cow. Now, why a cow? It seems that this is another attempt by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the sanctity that they have in their hearts towards the cow. Because again, in ancient Egypt, one of the most prominent deities was the golden bull, right? Apis, which had the form of a cow. So with Samiri, the golden statue has been completely destroyed and thrown into the sea. Now that golden calf was lifeless. They might still have reverence for a living, breathing cow. So here, the command is what? Slaughter a cow. To again demonstrate that this is not something that is worthy of worship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't only refute, because when you have a false idea that has been passed down from generation to generation, it's not enough to just refute it one time. You have to constantly refute it and demonstrate the preposterity of false beliefs. They're commanded to slaughter a cow. Now the reaction of Bani Israel is that, are you trying to ridicule us? Someone was killed and you're telling us to slaughter a cow? Musa alayhi salam, what does he say? قَالَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ أَنْ أَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. It's what's interesting is that this ayah reveals to us that they don't really believe that Musa receives revelation. Because he's not telling them, this is my opinion. He says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُكُمْ. Allah is commanding you to slaughter a cow. And they say, are you taking us as a joke? It's not coming from Musa, it's coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, you see these glimpses of weak faith. When they speak, it's clear that they don't actually believe that he's a recipient of revelation. Now, what's interesting about the way that Allah tells the story is that you would think that the story would begin with the murder. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the focus of the story is not about the murder, but rather Allah wants to bring attention to what? How disobedient Bani Israel is to Musa. That's a more serious problem. Because this attitude towards Musa is the reason why you will continue to suffer. Questioning his authority, thinking that what he's asking is completely ridiculous. So then what do? Eventually, so they initially question him, but then they start to ask Musa about the identity of this cow that they are to slaughter. Now, the command that Allah gave was very simple. Slaughter a cow. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't make it complicated. Slaughter a cow. Very simple instruction. But what do? Verse 68. قَالُوا ادْعُ لَنَا رَبَّكَ. They say to Musa, ask God, يُبَيِّن لَنَا مَا هِيَ. Ask God to tell us what type of cow. Now, what you notice here is, instead of focusing on the essence of the divine command, they start to ask unnecessary questions. And don't we all do this? The law of God is very simple. And sometimes we overcomplicate it. I'll give you a very simple example as to how we complicate something that was meant to be simple. Allah says, slaughter a cow. Simple. Well, what's the description? Allah didn't specify. He kept it simple. Keep it simple. For example, we have a juristic principle, قاعدة فقهية, that says, كل شيء لك طاهر حتى تعلم أنه قذر. Everything is طاهر until you have certainty, until you know that it is najis. Someone walks into the bathroom. The floor is wet. A little bit of wetness gets on his foot. He goes around asking, what is this fluid? What is this? Is this urine? Is this water? He conducts a full-fledged investigation. It's unnecessary. Yeah, that's an unnecessary question. Do you know for sure this is tahir? That this is najis? No, I don't know that this is najis. I'm not sure. As long as you don't know, assume that it's tahir and move on with your day. Very simple. You know, sometimes you're invited to someone's house. You go to a restaurant that's owned by a Muslim and they serve meat. And you know it's a Muslim owner. And you're not sure, is the meat halal or is it haram? The fiqh of Ahlul Bayt tell us what? If it's being given to you by a Muslim, if it's from the hand of a Muslim, assume that it is halal. Keep it simple. But you and I, we complicate things. Islam, the Islamic rulings, of course, there are instances where you need to, be specific. But where Islam has kept things simple, keep it simple. Inna Allah ya'murukum an tadhbahu baqara. Allah has commanded you to slaughter a cow. It's a very simple command. No, they say, no, what kind of cow is it? So look at what happens here. When you press Allah, Allah presses you. You want to make your life more difficult? Okay, two can play this game. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does he say? قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة لا فارض ولا بكر عوان بين ذلك فافعلوا ما تؤمرون. Now the description of the cow is, because you didn't fulfill that simple commandment, now things are going to get complicated because you chose this way. You chose to make it complicated. It's going to start getting complicated now. Very similar to us. Islam has made marriage very easy. But you want to make things a little bit more complicated. So things are going to get more complicated because you're making it more complicated. You want to have this party and that party, and we add layers of complication for no reason. So now the description of the cow is what? It is a cow, Allah now says, it is a cow that is neither old nor young. Now it has to be a middle-aged cow. So now it's become a little bit more difficult. If they just slaughtered a regular cow, it would have been done with. But asking unnecessary questions, complicating the matter. Now, again, their initial reaction to Musa was, this doesn't make sense. There was a murder and you're saying, slaughter a cow. The problem, and this is very relevant to us. Stop trying to always understand the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us to do certain things. Imam Zain al-Abidin, what does he say? Inna deen Allah la yusab bil-uqul al-naqis. That the religion of God cannot be fully understood by the deficient intellects of human beings. Now, yes, there are certain things that you have to prove rationally. The core beliefs have to be established rationally. The belief in God, the belief in a life after death, but the Islamic rulings, the Islamic practices, we don't know the basis for why they were legislated. But we do know that this is what God commanded. See, the problem is, we want God to convince us before we submit to Him. What's the reason? And only when I'm convinced will I submit to God. So you're not really worshiping Allah. You're worshiping yourself. If I'm convinced, then I will submit. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intentionally, what does He do? The majority of the ahkam, we might speculate as to the wisdoms behind it, but we don't really know the basis. We don't know. Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mandate that we fast for 35 days? Why 1 month? Why not 2 months? Why not 15 days? Why isn't Salatul Dhuhr 6 rak'ah? Why is it not 2 rak'ah? No. Why is it that when a woman is menstruating, she doesn't have to make up her salah, but she has to make up her fast? Why? We don't know. We don't know. And it's okay not to know. Sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is training us to just trust Him. Don't be so obsessed with trying to figure everything out. That's not your job. Your job is to obey God and leave things in His hands. Now, yes, there are some instances where the Sharia has shed light regarding the basis for a ruling. But we don't know. You have to submit to the fact that there is divine wisdom behind everything that Allah asks us to do. Allah never asks us to do anything arbitrarily. So sacrifice this cow. They say, what type of cow? Simple ruling. Now they're making it more complicated on themselves. So now the command is what? Okay, now it can't be an old cow or a young cow. It has to be a middle-aged cow. Right? One that's going through a midlife crisis. Then, the next verse, verse 69. So now, a little bit of a description has been given. Verse 69, قَالُ ادْعُ لَنَا رَبَّكَ يُبَيِّنْ لَنَا مَا لَوْنُهَا. They come back to Musa. Oh, Musa, ask your Lord to tell us, what color is this cow? What color is it? Now, the command becomes even more strict. So what does Allah say? قَالَ إِنَّهُ يَقُولُ إِنَّهَا بَقَرَةٌ صَفْرَاء فَاقِعٌ لَوْنُهَا تَسُرُّ النَّاظِرِينَ. The cow has to be a bright yellow cow. فَاقِعٌ لَوْنُهَا, with a bright hue. That captivates your eyes. That's very pleasing to the onlookers. So now you have to find a middle-aged cow that's not just any color, not pale white, not pale yellow, bright yellow cow. So what do they do next? Verse 70, قَالُوا ادْعُ لَنَا رَبَّكَ يُبَيِّنْ لَنَا مَا هِيَ. They say, oh Musa, ask your God to reveal to us, what is this cow? that he wants us to slaughter? إِنَّ الْبَقَرَ تَشَابَهَ عَلَيْنَا, because all cows look the same to us. Which one? وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَمُهْتَدُونَ. If you just give us a little bit more details, we'll slaughter this cow. Now, Imam al-Ridha, salawatullahi alayhi, he says, if they had slaughtered any cow, it would have been sufficient. But here, we see that scholars have explained the reasons why they were making things so difficult. Why were they making a simple ruling so difficult? Number one, they say that one possible reason is that the intention behind these questions was not because they were actually looking for the answer. They were asking to make it so difficult that it's impossible for them to implement it, meaning that they were asking to evade. They were asking these questions not because they wanted to implement the law of God. They already knew what they wanted to do. They were just looking for an excuse not to do it. And sometimes we do this with what? With maraja. We already have the ruling that we want, we already have it in mind. And then let's ask this Maulana. Okay, we didn't get the answer that we wanted. Let's ask this Maulana. This Maulana seems, he's a little young. Maybe he's woke. Let's ask this guy. Why are you asking? These repetitive questions are for what purpose? Because you genuinely want to know the law of God, or you're trying to find the loophole? You're trying to evade. You're trying to make an excuse. So some scholars say that they were actually trying to evade implementing the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another explanation that has been given is that they did not want, so this elaborates on the first, they did not want to slaughter the cow because they still felt in their hearts that a cow is very sacred. So they were trying to look for excuses as to why they're not going to do it. They wanted to make the description so specific so they don't commit the sin of slaughtering a deity that they used to worship back in Egypt. They wanted to evade it. They didn't want to do it. But the whole purpose of this is what? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to eradicate that shirk from their hearts. Now, ayah 71, Musa alayhi salam says to them, قَالَ إِنَّهُ يَقُولُ إِن. So now what do we have? What type of cow are we looking for? We're looking for a middle-aged, bright yellow cow. As if that's not a specific description. They say, "Oh Musa, tell us what type of cow this is, because all the cows look the same to us." Verse 71. قال إنه يقول إنها بقرة لا ذلول تثير الأرض ولا تسقي الحرث. That now this is a cow that has all of the descriptions that were previously mentioned. And it also needs to be an untamed cow, meaning this is not a cow that has been used to till the earth, nor was it a cow that was used to irrigate the land. Meaning a middle-aged cow that's bright yellow that really hasn't been used for farming or used in the fields. مُسَلَّمَةٌ لَا شِيَةَ فِيهَا. And on top of all of that, it should not have any blemishes on it. No blemishes, no strange marks on it. Clean, untamed, fresh. What do they say? قَالُوا الْآنَ جِئْتَ بِالْحَقِّ. They say, now you have spoken the truth. Which means what? That everything that you mentioned before now is nonsense. Now you have spoken the truth. It's very interesting. The companions of Musa alayhi salam, after all these years, he's speaking to them and they're basically saying to him, that what you were saying before was nonsense. Musa Kalimullah, they're saying to him, what you were saying before is nonsense. Al-ana ji'ta bil-haq. Doesn't that remind you of something in the history of Islam? When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, when the Prophet was on his deathbed and the companions were gathered around him, and he said to them in the famous narration of the calamity of Thursday, Ituni bidawatin wa qirtas. Bring me, and there's different variations, bring me a pen and paper so that I can write something for you, that if you follow it, you will never go astray after me. Now, is there any rational person that could hear the final messenger of God? There's no more prophets after him. This is the final messenger of God who is saying to you that I want to write something down for you, that if you follow it, you will never go astray after me. Would any rational person be like, nah, we're good? In fact, what was said to the Prophet was even worse. You know, we laugh at this, but what was said to the Prophet was even worse. In Sahih Muslim, it states that what was said to the Prophet is what? The Quran is sufficient for us. Inna ar-rajula la yahjur. Inna Rasulallah yahjur. That the Prophet is hallucinating. He's speaking rubbish. So people ask, why is Musa the most mentioned prophet in the Quran? It's because in the life of the Prophet, we see the same struggles of Musa. Why does Allah speak so much about Bani Israel? It's because people don't change. It's the same story that's being repeated. Just the labels have been changed. The names of the individuals have changed. It's in a different part of the world. It's a different time. But it's the same attitude. It's the same insolence. It's the same stubbornness that has plagued the messengers of God for many generations. It's the same attitude. So what happens is, so we said that one reason why that they were so insistent upon asking these unnecessary questions is that they wanted to evade the fulfillment of that divine command. They didn't want to act on that divine command. And the second is because they had that reverence for the cow. They were probably trying to evade committing something that they felt was sacrilegious based on their old religious traditions in Egypt. And number three, some scholars have said that, as we mentioned, the Quran tells us that many of them were very stingy. And they did not want to pay the high price for the cow. Because look at what happened. Look at the justice of Allah, how it works. Some narrations say that among the 700,000, there was one young Jewish boy that had the cow with the exact description that they were looking for. But the price that he wanted to sell it for was very high. And it was a poor family. And they were about to not pay the price, but eventually they paid a very hefty price to the only boy who owned that cow. Now, who's this boy? Look at how the justice of Allah operates. That cow, according to some narrations, belonged to a very poor family. And this boy had a very unique relationship with his father. Because as you know, many of the Israelites, they passed away during this period, during the 40-year period where they were in the wilderness. This young boy was very dutiful to his father. The narrations say that his father, one night he was sleeping, and his mother had given him a cup of water to go and give to his father. It was dark. He goes into the room and he sees that his father is sound asleep. And it seems that perhaps the father probably he probably asked for the water, but then he fell asleep. So the boy comes to the room and now his father is sleeping. And it's so dark that he says, if I put the cup next to my father, he might not notice it because it's dark. And I don't want to wake up my father because he's sound asleep. Some narrations say that that little boy stood the entire night holding that cup of water until the morning. When that father woke up, he saw his son. It's very similar to the story that I mentioned during the Q&A session. When that father woke up, he prayed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would shower his son with rizq. He passes away, and the only inheritance he leaves for his son is that strange looking cow. And it was that cow that the Israelites had to purchase to fulfill the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that cow was a punishment for them. Allah made it more difficult for them because of how unwilling they were to fulfill the command of Allah. But it was a reward for who? It was a reward for that young boy who was respectful to his father. Now what happens next is verse 70. So now this dead cow is going to be used to reveal the identity of the murderer. So if you look at verse 72, وَإِذْ قَتَلْتُمْ نَفْسًا فَادَّارَأْتُمْ فِيهَا. Allah then starts from the beginning. So again, all of these ayat are speaking about the stubbornness of Bani Israel when it comes to obeying Musa. That's the focus of the story. And then Allah then brings up the murder. And he says, and remember, O Bani Israel, when you killed someone and you started to fight amongst yourself. وَاللَّهُ مُخْرِجٌ مَا كُنْتُمْ تَكْتُمُونَ. And Allah was preparing to reveal what you had concealed. Remember, my dear brothers and sisters, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world, there are certain things, if they can just answer the phone. La ilaha illallah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Let's wait, maybe we can also listen on the call too. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sister, send our salam to your family, please. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does he do here? What does he do? Khalas, we'll just have to continue. What does he do? Allah sends a very powerful message in this ayah, and that is what? He says that, and God will reveal what they try to conceal. Now, this is not just related to the story of Musa. This is a general principle that especially when it comes to goodness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with some crimes, Allah will not allow certain crimes to go unexposed. Yes, there are many sins that are concealed and Allah keeps it that way. There are some crimes that eventually will be exposed. And also, there are some virtues that will never be concealed, even though people may try to conceal them. An example is, when I read this verse, I think a lot about Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen. Allah says what? He will bring out what you try to conceal. Brothers and sisters, the Umayyads, the likes of Muawiyah, they tried their best to conceal the virtues of Amir al-Mu'mineen. They had all the money in the world. They bought the most eloquent scholars in the world to curse and to tarnish the name of Ali ibn Abi Talib. There were governments who were behind this movement to tarnish Ali ibn Abi Talib. It's the equivalent of having, imagine Bani Umayyah was in existence today. Bani Umayyah, you think Russian bots are, Bani Umayyah would have their own bots on social media trying to tarnish the image of Ali ibn Abi Talib, just to give you an idea of what that means in our contemporary times. Allah says, I will bring out what the people try to conceal. Even after all of these years of censorship, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still exposed the virtues of Ali ibn Abi Talib. It's the irony of ironies is that the man who ruled over Sham, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the man who had more wealth and more power than any of the early Muslim rulers, who had a propaganda machine that would put the propaganda machines today to shame, he failed. 14 centuries after, Muawiyah is nowhere. And then you see that golden dome in Najaf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed what they tried to conceal. You see, when you're sincere, you don't even need to market for yourself. When you're sincere, when you do things purely for Allah, when you live for Allah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be your reputation manager. Allah will elevate you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will expose your virtues. And even after all of that sense, so all of the virtues and all of the accolades of Ali ibn Abi Talib is probably just a drop from the ocean of the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen that was actually said by the Prophet. And that's why the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what does he say? He says to Ali ibn Abi Talib that, "Oh Ali, if I were to tell the people your merits," he says, "I'm afraid to share your merits with the people because I'm afraid that they will say about you what the Jews said about Jesus. If I were to speak to the people about your virtues, they would be so mesmerized and so amazed that whenever you walk by a group of people, they would fight to take the dust from your feet." This is what the Prophet says. Wallahu mukhrijun ma kuntum taksumun. Allah is going to expose what you tried to hide. And then what does Allah say? Verse 73, فَقُلْنَا ضْرِبُوهُ بِبَعْضِهَا. Take apart, take a bone of that cow that you slaughtered and strike it against the dead body, the body of that man who was killed. كَذَلِكَ يُحْيِي اللَّهُ الْمَوْتَى وَيُرِيكُمْ آيَاتِهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. That man, through the medium of that bone, was revived. He was brought to life according to the Quran, and he comes to life and he exposes the individual that killed him. Now I want to end with this. Some mystical scholars, they look at this verse and they say that there is a very deep spiritual lesson here. And that lesson is that in order to revive the soul, because a human being was revived by slaughtering a cow. The Urafa, some of the mystics have said, and again, this is just possible. We're not saying that this is absolutely what the ayah means. It's a possibility. It's an interpretation. Some have said that the meaning, the mystical meaning of this verse is that to revive the life of the soul, you have to kill the animalistic self. Because a cow is an animal. You have to kill the animalistic tendencies in you for your spiritual life to flourish. And this is the story of man. The entire Quran is all about nurturing the aql, allowing nafsul mutma'inna to be activated and not to allow a nafsul ammara to take over. That's the story of the human being. That's the struggle. That's the internal struggle between good and evil. And we see that, that theme throughout the story of Musa. Inshallah, beginning tomorrow night, we'll spend some time speaking about another phase in the life of Musa and Bani Israel. And this relates to the incident of Musa alayhi salam and Khidr. And I know many of you have heard the story, you've read it, but inshallah, I'm quite confident that we'll share some insights that maybe you didn't consider, inshallah. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.